All right, welcome back. We are here with John Clippinger, and we will be discussing active inference, BioFirm, homeostatic agents for bioregional and regenerative finance. So, thank you, John. Looking forward to this presentation and discussion and more.
Daniel, thank you so much for doing this and hosting this. It's been a great set of sessions. It really has. It's been very informative. And this is a follow-up on a session that we had yesterday on basically what active inference agents and why they're important, and looking at them in an application. And in this case, in this session, we were going to look at active inference agents in terms of a concept called BioFirm as a homeostatic agents for bioregional and regenerative finance. We're really looking at taking the thinking behind active inference agents and applying it to a new notion of the firm that's inherently biomimetic. And what I wanted with these series of slides is to sort of set up the conversation and the discussion that we're going to have later with Andrew and Daniel on providing an in-depth look at biofirms as a homeostatic agent that is capable of interacting with the environment in a way that preserves it and preserves itself and the environment. So what I'd like to begin with is sort of this premise. I've been involved in looking at regenerative finance and issues around climate change for at least the last 10 years. And I think there's a growing consensus that we need a new kind of science-based economy based in enhancing life and nature and equality. We really need to think about what are the economic incentives to make a transition to an economy that values the preservation of life and nature rather than the extraction or destruction of it. And what we don't need is what we're now feeling the consequences of it, and that's the commodification of nature and people, turning them into objects and assets that can be bought and sold and trade without any discrimination between sort of what kind of asset we're talking about. Are we talking about something that is coal, is water, is life, the biosphere? They're all assets. They can all be priced and they all can be traded. And so you just have the problem of total fungibility when actually some things are essential for existence and they exist in relationship to other things to be preserved as living things. And then the other problem, and we're seeing it, experiencing it widespread just today, so the unbounded sort of concentration of wealth and power. So you have a system that works towards monopolies and the concentration of wealth and privilege. And this, of course, has created enormous pressures, not only sort of on the ecology, but on the whole society itself. And you have this notion of maximizing individual utility. So everything is about freedom of the individual as an atomic agent, independent of the context in which they live and their impact upon others, not just other people, but their other species, the whole environment. And so we have extractive metrics that with a negative externality. So in other words, you can create economic returns, but what you're doing is creating a negative externality. It would be pollution, or it'd be air pollution, destruction of species or habitat. This is not reflected in the price. And then it's left to some other party, to a public good party, to clean up the mess. But they're not able to clean up the mess fast enough that it's being created. So we have a sort of a zero-sum, winner-take-all incentive structure, and we have a lack of transparency and accountability. So there's no sense of collective purpose. So this is really forced people to rethink what an economy should be, and what it would be to have biomimetic firms in an economy, something that actually worked in concert with nature, not against nature. So the first thing is important is not to have any negative externalities. This idea that you can offset the cost of something is going to be picked up by other parties. Since they're carbon credits and offsets are really a failed attempt to deal with negative externalities. And we need to have non-zero sum incentives. In other words, incentivize the collaboration and cooperation of parties to take joint outcomes rather than maximizing utility for a single individual. And we need to have a new way of recognizing that value is created in a really scientific incredible sense that bio is recognized, the value is recognized through biocapacity and diversity and resilience. Have that be a notion of value, not just as something that maximizes a price arbitrage, but actually creates new kind of value. The other important thing I think is coming into focus is this idea of agency. And this is a sort of a new concept that thinks that nature should have agency. We should have an agency, and we should have agency of thinking of nature as being given the capacity to be itself, and species to be itself, and people to be themselves, and not have that be restricted. And with that, I think we comes the notion of what we call sort of homeostatic fungibility. In other words, how something is the value of that is realized is in relation to keeping other things alive. If you look at the human body, it's like you can't maximize the utility of the heart against the brain or the lungs. They all exist together. So how you allocate resources in the body is really maintaining the balances between those different kinds of organs. And that's true of nature, and that's true of organizations. What we need also is a sort of scale-free and domain-free metrics that's scientific and adaptable. So we really need to have the scientific process be a fundamental organizing principle by how we recognize and exchange value. And this means having something that's it really is transparent, explainable. You can't have something that's a black box that's not opaque, that you don't know where it comes from, you don't know how to trust it, you don't know how to derive it. It really needs to be something that's transparent. And so we've seen people talk about the blockchain and things like that, but it's more than just the blockchain. It's a whole set of methods, being able to see how something is derived and be able to replicate that. And then the idea of scalable learning. Systems should learn and they should improve over time. Markets don't necessarily do that. They actually have clear a market around a price and then they start again. There's no memory. There's no learning how to do something better. For adaptation as a people and in a planet, we need to learn. We need to learn, improve upon ourselves. I mean, that should be part of our whole economy, not something that's tangential to it. And finally, the whole idea of governance. Governance should not be something applied after the fact or top down. It should really be embedded in the whole system of itself. And so there's been a lot of talk about decentralized governance and decentralized systems, decentralized autonomous organizations. But a lot of that is just talk. They're not really fully autonomous and not fully decentralized. But how do you really realize that vision? And these ideas have really sort of were first, I think, articulated and recognized by the economist Eleanor Ostrom, who got a Nobel Prize for her work on the governance of the commons. And she was the first woman economist to do that. And I'd worked with Eleanor when I was at Harvard at the Berkman Center and looking and trying to get thinking about a digital commons. And it was too early. But here are some of the central principles that she had. And this is back then when the technology was not very developed, but she developed her thinking based upon how indigenous people manage their resources, their common resources. And that would be their forestry, their fisheries, the things that they've done for thousands of years, and they're able to keep them in balance and keep their lifestyle in balance through that. And here were some principles she extracted from that. So it was clearly defined boundaries. And you needed to have a common pool resource where people recognize as a common pool resources. You had to have it congruent with local conditions. And I think by that, in other words, you had to recognize each little bioregion had its own peculiar constraints and issues that you needed to recognize. And you had to have ways that people could make collective choices among up commons, how bring people together. They couldn't be anonymous from one another. They really had to be, they had to know each other and they'd be accountable to one another. And you had monitoring process. You had to monitor it and be able to see where you were. And then if something goes wrong, you have what she called graduated sanctions, which means it was the punishment was commensurate with the degree of the violation. But you really didn't want to have a highly punitive system that has its own negative results. And you had various mechanisms for resolving conflict. And then I think the idea of one of the things her concerns with, particularly with indigenous people, is that the legitimacy of those organizations were recognized by the larger nation state, that they had some genuine sovereignty and integrity. And finally, this whole idea of nested enterprises, so recognizing it wasn't a strict hierarchy. There was things that dynamically interacted at different scales. And these are ideas that were sort of more metaphors at the time. They were aspirational metaphors, but it was very hard to realize in any kind of operational form. And she went on to talk about later work on socio-ecological systems and recognize the biophysical and the social factors, how they all work together, and how you look across different spatial and temporal scales and different hierarchies, how they're linked. And she was always trying to think about what were the dynamic, complex systems that really could characterize by adaptation if you're going to have governance, but where there really wasn't a mechanism there for how to realize those ideas. Now, there's another more recent development. It's called Tahanu, that was started by a friend of mine. His name is Jonathan Lagarde, in Africa, and they're doing this in Rwanda, and they're doing it with all kinds of species. They're starting out with the gorillas of Rwanda, but the idea is that animals, species, contribute to the environment and they should be paid for the value that they created. So how do you do that? You're giving agency not only to the animal, but to the habitat. In this case, in Rwanda, they want to give not only agency to, say, Rwanda gorillas, but they want to give agency to rivers and certain bioregions. And by agency, I mean the fact that these things in staying alive can be valued for their capacity to stay alive and create a habitat that creates a successful and resilient environment. And so this is a quote from their literature, their website, which I recommend you taking a look at. It exists with the belief that for these species to live, they must actively participate in the economy. So how do you create a new economy that includes living things, and how do you recognize that value? Another approach is something that's come from Regen Networks, which has been working on this for a number of years, and I've worked with them. And they're talking about creating ecological institutions. And again, it's like, what is an institution? An institution, in the classic sense, is separation of people from a set of principles, like the rule of law. You say, well, here's an institution, and it's set up to do these things, and people should perform certain roles in an institution. But the problem with institutions is that they're run by people, people get corrupted, and the institutions don't work. In this case, what they're trying to do is develop a constitution for what they call an ecological subject. And again, it's giving agency and recognition to nature. And then they have a number of methods by which to govern that and put in a ledger, create some token system. Region's been doing this kind of work for quite a while. All part of it, a common effort. Another effort is something called a bioregional hub, and this will be my last example before making the transition. But the idea of a bioregional hub is that to pull together different parties in a particular geospatial location and be able to give them a set of finance and incentives by which they can act to actually create the biocapacity of that particular georegion. And so it's really working with core communities that are committed to actually enhancing it could be a river system. It could be one of the areas they're looking at in Northeast bioregion is the Connecticut River. How can you bring it back to where it was with abundance when they had full salmon? It was a very rich ecological system. But there are other things in terms of landowners and being able to give them the incentives to rewild their property and actually make a living on that and create an economy, an exchange of value in such a way that makes it robust and resilient. And so they're working with different kinds of investors and social impact investors in order to make this kind of happen. So this is part of a larger collection of people who are trying to do these things. Now, what we're going to say, and this is a very I apologize for the verbiage here, but what we're going to say, and what you're going to hear in the subsequent discussion is this idea of a biofirm which is a firm that is based upon homeostatic principles And it really, I think, addresses the many issues, both operational and aspirational, that you see in the whole biofinance movement. And to run through these fairly quickly, but you're going to find Andrew and Daniel are going to talk about these things in detail with examples, is that it's first principles based. It's grounded in scientific method, Bayesian statistics, and Markov blankets. In other words, you drill down to it and you really understand it rigorously as a science. You can understand what it's based upon and why, how things work in a principled way. It's also computationally tractable at scales and for metrics for doing the whole kind of reporting and that you have this required environmental reporting. They call it MRVs. And so do you have a method by which you can make statements and claims about the state of the environment that scales and can be used for cross comparisons? It's also going to be, it's open source. So the BioFirm is like a kernel. Think of it as a Linux kernel for a new kind of organizational structure, can then generate a new kind of economy that's biometrically based. Another key component is if we're going to scale our capacity to deal with nature, it's going to be a lot is going to have to be automated. There's so many tasks involved in different parts of the world that you have different skill sets. How do you automate some very complex things in a way that can be trusted and generate metrics that other people are willing to accept? This has been a big problem in climate change. And this is where an extraordinary automation of cognitive tasks through large language models, transformers, and agent architecture allows for an automation of many of the tasks of collecting and analyzing the data and learning from the data. This is very significant. And then you have the capacity to create networks of agents working together and to create a system of exchange. So that's a natural evolution that's happening into edge-based computing, that you can have computing on the edge, you can security on the edge. So that's another phenomena. And then I think the idea of polycentric governments, this is made of that, but what does that really mean? Well, it really means if you look at agents that are self-organizing agents and dynamically relating to one another on the basis of the free energy principle, these other principles, you have the effect of a polycentric governance. And you also have the ability to formally give agency to nature, to different species, to different peoples, to different kind of competencies. So that is the whole nature, as I say, of an agentic architecture. And then I think you have a principal means of interfacing between a biometric economy and the current economy. That's going to be really important. So you can't just live in your own little world. You're going to have to interchange with the fiat economy of the world in such a way that actually protects and establishes the value of a biometric economy. And finally, I think it provides a principal basis for valuing nature-based currencies and assets that we can discuss a little bit in the time to come. So that's basically my comments. I think that I always like to end and say, let's make it real. That we're actually, I think you'll see in the following discussions, we're at a point where I think the technology is getting sufficiently mature to actually engage in developing use cases of this and bring it to scale. So with that, I'll hand it over to Andrew. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, John. Quick mention to Daniel. John and I had a really nice conversation prior to this. If it's possible, I might actually start my talk now. And then, yeah,
Sure.
Perfect. I was hoping that would be the case. And then that way, John and I can also have a little bit of back and forth potentially during the course. And obviously, Daniel, you've had such a big hand in the development. So anytime, you would like to chime in, please feel free. Great. So, cool. All right. So my original plan talk for today was entitled, let me get rid of this guy. Active Inference is a framework for social science-based modeling. And, okay.
Something happened on the way to the symposium.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Huge updates. I want to just give a little bit of context. For some time now, I've, I personally gave a talk a couple of months ago, a 3.5 hour workshop, basically at an international conference for computational social sciences, held at University of Pennsylvania, July 17th this year. And what I was trying to do was basically teach computational social scientists, that means economists, sociologists, political scientists, and so on, who are very savvy with computers, essentially, how we might be able to employ active inference in agent-based modeling, which is already, a decades old at this point, method of designing basically simulations of agents inside of environments where agents might be, human beings, and an environment might be, a market system or some other kind of environment that humans find themselves in, where you can play out simulations and test things and so on. I want to introduce that to computational social scientists, and I think more broadly, what's great is that this symposium now gives me the opportunity to kind of flip it to where I can kind of bring some of what computational social science does to other active inference researchers. But to stay on with the BioFirm, I really wanted to, again, as Daniel said, something happened on the way to the symposium. Uh, I've had these conversations with John since I did that conference, and I have a lot of kind of strong intuition that a lot of what he's been describing is a really wonderful sort of direction for future work in both agent-based modeling, but also applications of that kind of in the real world. I mean, we're always operating under conditions of, uncertainty and trying to figure out kind of what to do in very adaptive ways where our environment is constantly changing from, implementation of computers, social networks. We have climate change. We have the typical booms and busts of our economic systems and so on. So I'll start here, but I just want it to be known, like, there have been a lot of heavy revisions to this with a lot of development we've made on the BioFirm, thus featuring BioFirm. So again, I'm Andrew Pashea. My day job, I work as a data analyst slash scientist slash engineer, always many roles to fill. And so I bring a lot of those kind of skills with me to active inference and how I view things like developing kind of applications for specific use cases and things like that. I think that there can be a lot of rich interdisciplinary dialogue between different fields, and that includes the kinds of things I do on a day-to-day basis versus my interest in active inference, which has been going for the past few years now. So I've been an intern, and I suppose I'm feeling much more like a full-time kind of affiliate of the institute at this point. I've been teaching the textbook group with Daniel, co-facilitating that. I've been involved in various projects, and then now this kind of partnership with First Principles First, and what Dr. Clippinger is trying to accomplish in developing the BioFirm. So I just want to put, on this title slide here, these are actually links to, if you would like to get involved with the Active Inference Institute, check out all the kinds of things that are being put out by First Principles First. And also, I just want it to be known, like, you can come back to these slides as needed, as well as any of the other kind of learning materials I've been producing, whether it be for the conference that I did a couple months ago, including on the code, how to actually create active inference agents from scratch, moving up to multi-agent simulations and so on. I also did a talk with the Institute recently that kind of walks through some of the code. So the new outline for this talk, we're going to touch again on agent-based modeling, which we already talked about yesterday a little bit in the first workshop. So we're going to kind of skim through that a little bit, but I want to put some special attention upon the aspect that of agent-based modeling, referring to what are called micro assumptions about behavior. Point blank, if we're going to simulate humans, we have to include certain assumptions about how we think humans behave if we're going to simulate them in an environment, right? Otherwise, we can create a list of humans. They do nothing until we give them some kind of rules or behavioral, dynamics or something along those lines. So those are essential for setting up agent-based modeling. And then we'll shift over into active inference. We'll look at the POMDP as a kind of exemplar model, talk about some multi-agent examples, just to give a sense of what kind of work can be done in this area. Many people watching this now who are already involved with active inference. There'll be some aspects of this that are, might come off as a little repetitive, but I don't want to, I want to stick to the textbook, so to speak, right? I want to kind of keep this grounded in a sense that, folks who know about active inference, don't know about active inference, have some vague interest in active inference in this in-between area, like can catch on to the material here. Next, we'll go into this question, are LLMs agents? There's a lot of exciting work being done with LLMs. They're showing incredibly exciting and surprising, sophisticated reasoning skills and capacities for dealing with natural language. That said, and it's already been said so many times in the other talks given in the, during the symposium, but it's worth repeating. Like, they have limits, there are issues, and I've been doing some work on thinking through how do LLMs relate to things like cognitive theories? How does an LLM think, or how does that work really, so that we can really grasp if we want to incorporate LLMs into, say, agent-based modeling, software applications, or otherwise. Let's come to terms with like the reality of what they are before assuming too much about what they are or what they're capable of, and furthermore, how we might be able to integrate them into kind of more grounded means doing agent-based modeling, such as working with actual agents. The quick answer to are LLMs agents? Are they agents? No, that's the quick answer. They're not. That's what I will claim. And then we'll move on to the BioFirm, which frankly will take up the majority of the rest of the talk from there. So, what is agent-based modeling? As already stated, we have agents. More specifically, it's a programmed entity. It could be a person, a living organism. It could be representative of an entire institution or otherwise. And basically, programmatically, it receives observations from its environment, and then it returns actions back into its environment. For example, an agent could be a person, an investor. And then with the environment, the environment could be an artificial or real system that elicits observations for agents and then receives the agent's actions. Those actions then impact the environment itself in turn. For example, the environment could be a stock market. So we see that there's a reciprocal relationship between the two things. An agent or environment's action is an environment or agent's observation. So the agent sees a price signal from the environment, they make a purchase. Next morning, prices have adjusted, given that agent, maybe other agents, purchases. You see, so there's this kind of back and forth in a loop, at certain time intervals, such as in time steps, or we could imagine them in days, like on day one, this happened, day two, this happened. In active inference, the agent and environment's respective Markov blankets, which kind of define what it is to be that entity, whether it be the agent or what it means to be that environment, including all the structure, the characteristics. If it's a person, then maybe it includes things like their goals or their what it means to maintain homeostasis. So an individual has blood and oxygen flows in their body. What does it mean to be that entity? So from there, we simulate them. We play out the agent environment dynamics over time. Again, as I said, in time steps, some other kind of interval. And then in active inference, we often use the phrase action perception loop. It's like you do something, then you perceive the outcome, you elicit your next action, receive the outcome, and then arguably this happens at a very rapid pace in actual human beings, right? This goes beyond just time step 1 or 2. Or we measure this in nanoseconds or otherwise. So core guidelines for setting up agent-based models. We want to make realistic yet simple as possible agents and environments. That has to do with generalizability. If you make something that's so unique to a particular situation, it might not generalize well. So if you want to make an agent-based model of, say, agents taking care of a natural environment, if you make the agents way too specific to that environment, to where they, if you want to set up this agent-based model, get insights into what you can do in reality, you want to make sure that what you test in the model can actually be carried out in reality. It can't be too specific. It can't be off course. Um, Robustness, simply small changes don't dramatically change results. If you fine tune something too much, such that the results of the experiment end up being dramatically different, then suddenly, once again, we have that generalizability problem. Reproducibility, everyone knows reproducibility problems exist in modern science. We need to document and publish, our code, make it available to other people so they can understand it, recreate the results, etc. And finally, usefulness, which is simply, why do this? If we can't get any kind of additional useful insights out of setting up these rather complex computer models and programs, why do it? And so it's worth having that in mind. Not all models are right, but some models can be useful, right? In the statistician George Box's words. Then purpose. So we do agent-based modeling in order to predict outcomes. We could try and extrapolate from the present. We can entertain different kinds of hypothetical scenarios, design new policies, and have them play out over the course of the simulation, see what the outcome is. And then we can also look at collective outcomes of aggregated individual behaviors. If all stock investors in my simulation all began investing in this particular stock, like what happens by the next day? Do we end up with some kind of bubble and then bust kind of situation? Like what occurs, that kind of thinking. And then over the past couple decades, and this is really what I wanted to highlight a couple months ago, and what I would like to highlight now again, and I think it's especially relevant for anyone wanting to do agent-based modeling, and especially folks who are interested in active inference, there's been a cognitive turn. A lot of these traditional agent-based models, they're very interesting. A lot of thought has been put into them, but their agents tend to be very simplistic. In part because 40 years ago we were working with much more, at this point, archaic computers and computer architectures and devices that simply could not run simulations that involved many interacting agents who all have highly sophisticated behaviors. Furthermore, it's called a cognitive turn, not a complexity turn, but a cognitive turn, in the sense that we're looking at actually more closely approximating human behavior. So that means actually looking at other fields ranging from neuroscience, cognition, psychology, social sciences. That means looking at cybernetics, biology. Trying to open up the discourse and the dialogues over how can we more better approximate human behavior. So there's some common characteristics for these calls to cognitive agents. That includes like having agents have beliefs. They update their beliefs based upon what they see. They have to infer what to do, in a sense that they're more autonomous. They kind of make their own decisions. Traditional agent-based modeling, it's like, well, if the agent sees X, then they do Y. Otherwise, they do Z. And these highly simplistic, programmatic rules that the program, I program them that way, so I already know that they're going to do that. Whenever it comes to agent-based modeling with cognitive agents, I don't necessarily know exactly what they're going to do. They kind of make their own decisions, right? They have the architecture for that. And then also reinforcement learning, which is kind of a adjacent or subfield in some ways of like machine learning, data science. A lot of these kind of state of the art, but still rather standardized at this point, ways of doing modern data processing and analytics and predictions and forecasting. Reinforcement learning is a way of doing that where you actually have an agent, right? So that's been kind of one of the main ways people are trying to continue this cognitive turn in agent-based modeling. Now, micro assumptions. It's a lot of information for a single slide, so it'll be over soon. But I really just wanted to give kind of a picture of there's so much research that's been done, so many more kind of dialogues between fields that can occur here now. when thinking about how to make cognitive agents, what makes sense, what's realistic, but what also balances complexity and accuracy, keeps things simple enough to where the agent-based model can actually be useful. So there's been a lot of criticism at this point, centuries of criticism of this kind of neoclassical tradition, classical then neoclassical tradition, Adam Smithian kind of tradition that tends to paint humans as utility maximizers. It's often criticized because it's too simplistic. It reduces people to being greedy or immoral, as if they're just going after, profit without any concern for any other, condition or needs or wants or, so it's kind of selfishness, right? Without any form of altruism or sense of community. Some people point to economist Lionel Robbins, kind of a classic in the field, who claim that unlimited wants, scarce resources, that is the fundamental economic problem. Yet this assumption, I think this gets overlooked. I also criticize the utility maximizer assumption, but I want people to be aware that this leads to a really useful tool, which is for agent-based modeling. You can severely reduce computational costs for putting together agent-based models if you just have a bunch of agents who are trying to act to maximize a singular value. There's not a lot of complexity there. You can run those equations quite quickly, right? And then that also assumes that the main thing in your environment is the singular value that is utility, or a stand-in might be money or some general notion of liquidity. And so since then, we've had so many other ways of looking at human behavior, behavioral economics and finance, psychology, cognitive science, social theory. Humans aren't just trying to maximize utility. They're speculative. They don't have fixed preferences. They actually look at one another's decision makings. This goes back to John Maynard Keynes. We had Hyman P. Minsky, who looked at market crashes. We have Robert J. Schiller, who's still alive today and writing on narrative economics, the idea that ideas have an impact on how we interact with our economy and how we behave. There's Kahneman's thinking fast and slow. Like sometimes we just rely upon heuristics, or maybe we do it a lot of the time. It's quicker. It mitigates having to put a lot of thought into things where we just kind of want to get something done, even though it's not necessarily maximizing utility. There's Fowler and Sunstein's nudge. It's like sometimes, you do just go with the default option. Some people, whenever a website asks them, like, do you accept all of the cookies? They will click yes quickly just because they want the thing off their screen, right? And then we have social emulation, mimesis, convergence, ideology, all of these theories. What is money? It brings up the question of what is utility, what is money. Currency actually isn't just a means of exchange. It's not just. It can also be a store of value as its own value changes to try and do kind of economic transfers to make sure that you get higher value out of whatever form of currency you're holding. It's also a social institution, though. Is much broader, right? So having access to money, as many of us know, allows you to be, first you have access to a variety of commodities, assuming you're in a market economy where many things are fungible and tradable in that way. And then we also have social belonging. It's very difficult to maintain yourself in a society where you have no money, right? So that's a whole dimension that is lost if we just look at something like maximizing utility. I've put a mention of Louis Althusser, which is a much more kind of critical theory approach, but it looks at the impact of state law, different forms of coercion upon people to act and behave in particular ways that go beyond just their ability to try and maximize their own profit. But pragmatism, people update their beliefs. They're forward looking. They don't maintain the same preferences and ideas and rules throughout history. They change, they have their own circumstances. And so there's a kind of pragmatic approach to life. Karl Polanyi, economic activity is embedded in society, meaning that a lot of the economic activities that we have, they themselves are predicated upon our ability to trust one another, work with one another, and all these other kind of things, where whenever that trust is harmed, it can dramatically change how that economic activity plays out. And then we have neuroscience, biology, physics, and that you can see how we're moving more in the active inference direction now. But we have these are predominant theories now in neuroscience. The idea of predictive processing, that that one comes to a situation with their prior beliefs, and they can be updated in the sense of the Bayesian brain hypothesis, a kind of way of mathematizing that process. We also have, and this is quite old now, but it still stands as a rule like Hebbian learning or associative learning. So someone who associates money with being something bad very well might not, have such a drive for money versus relative to other things. And then homeostasis, allostasis being planning for homeostasis or homeostasis in the future. These are obvious things for us that we deal with on the day to day. We need to fulfill our needs, physiological needs, neurobiological needs, unconscious processes in the brain. That goes beyond being able to say that every single thing that we do is necessarily conscious or deliberate, right? I'm not actively trying to think about how to regulate my blood or oxygen flow right now. We also take preventative actions. We do things that might be a cost right now, but they change, the impact of whatever happens in the future for us. We are forward looking in various ways, and we do often rely upon habits as needed to fulfill our needs. Habits allow us to do things without having to put in too much expenditure, mental expenditure, metabolic expenditure, to ensure that our needs are going to continuously be fulfilled. And cybernetics, embedded cognition, this is the idea that behavior and even intelligence arise from interactions between brain, body, and environment, which kind of overcomes some of these ideas, classical ideas of cognition mainly being outside in, where you just kind of look at what's around you and then you take that in as a passive observer. Instead, we're actually always in communication with what's around us, and mortal computation, in the sense of we can move in the direction of, if we want to do something like cognitive modeling, then we're looking more at, actually trying to mirror these kinds of processes that are much more realistic. Collaboration, imitation, computational neuroscience, psychiatry, and modeling internal dynamics in form of, time series neuroimaging data, applying different kinds of techniques like causal inference to see how one factor impacts another, one variable impacts another. Actually trying to find correlations between internal neuronal dynamics with actual behaviors that occur. So for example, sticking, kind of electrophysiological like electrodes on, a mouse in a T maze to see like, okay, what kinds of neuronal dynamics correlate with, the rat choosing to go left to find the reward, find the cheese or otherwise, and then taking that and trying to move in the direction of, creating an agent who basically is fit to the behavior of that mouse or rat in the T maze, right? And that's a classic kind of example that's looked at in active inference. And we also have the Hamiltonian principle of least action, much more in the realm of physics, and it deserves a whole slide or 10 on its own. But the main idea figuratively is the idea of something occurring based on following whatever the easiest path is from one state to another. So a lot of these themes, the idea of social homeostasis, relying upon heuristics versus planning and forward looking versus dealing with whatever's going on in the moment just because you need to figure out what to do now, even though it's not something you planned for. All these kind of aspects start to come together, I argue, in active inference. So it's kind of like, should we be considering something like Homo economicus revised? Again, liquidity is a means for all commodities, at least in a market economy, at least assuming fungibility of things. That liquidity can get you many, many things. In a certain way, I almost want to dial it back on saying it's immoral to want liquidity. It allows you to fulfill your needs, again, in a market economy by seeking out necessities for your own homeostasis or allostasis, physiological relief or otherwise. Even then, even as your bank account increases, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have your social needs met, kinship or familial needs met, physical health. If a doctor tells me after I've suffered some kind of injury that I actually need to do stretches now in order to make sure that my arm will move going forward in the way that I need it to. It doesn't matter how large my bank account is, I'm still going to have to do those stretches, right? So there, this is a simplistic example, but all of this is to say, for agent-based modeling, rather than thinking of utility, especially utility in some vague abstract sense of, is it money? Is it liquidity? Is it something else? There could be a shift to a kind of alternative, what is essentially a virtually contextually universal value computed by the brain, which can encompass not just to drive to liquidity, but other aspects of means of life. Simple as possible, yet no simpler. And then it itself becomes a simplified recordable metric for measuring one's capacity for current and future survival. And so that, enter the free energy principle, which is one of the central principles of active inference. Here we're minimizing a quantifiable uncertainty. That by minimizing this, it allows us to achieve our goals, fulfill our needs. We learn, we actually change our minds. We learn new information. We are not fixed beings who, are kind of one-dimensional. We update our beliefs. And free energy is a proxy for uncertainty or surprise. It's computed quite easily, because it's a variational quantity. There's an approximate computation, which, in physical living beings, that keeps our metabolic costs low. And for agent-based modeling, that also means keeping computational costs low. And so it still kind of fits, the usefulness of what utility was for agent-based modeling. I think that free energy can instead be the new kind of metric that we're looking at. And I included this kind of fun fact that there was a nice talk given not too long ago with Active Inference Institute. Some folks who do neuromorphic computing just reminded us, like, despite how many calories our bodies use on the day-to-day, the brain only requires roughly 4 bananas worth of calories, despite the fact that it makes 10 to the 15th calculations per second. It's just a reminder of like this variational aspect, right, of being able to do quicker approximations. And then we talk a lot about free energy, but I really, in the kind of funniest kind of way, I just have always been fascinated by this equation. This is a textbook equation from active inference, but so G is our expected free energy related to deliberative planning, goal attainment, information seeking, conditioned on our homeostatic preferences, right? So we plan for things to take care of ourselves, to accomplish things we need to. F is variational free energy, another quantity where we balance the complexity and accuracy of how do we deal with the moment. Then we can think of this as like, say you're camping in the woods and suddenly there's a bear. It's like, well, you didn't plan for that. And you didn't expect that, and coming up against a potentially dangerous bear is probably very much against your preferences for maintaining your homeostasis, in this case, your sense of physical safety. So you have to deal with that. And then E, those are your habits, your heuristics. So what I'm saying is that I particularly appreciate that we have a quantifiable way, here of trying to decide what it is that determines someone's actual behavior, the posterior beliefs, high, meaning what policy or action should I take, right? All of that is kind of all these different considerations, habits, deliberative planning, moment-to-moment planning, all these things are involved in that. So it's an attempt at, from my perspective, like, we're actually combining many of these interdisciplinary perspectives into a single equation there. And so active inference, I think I appreciate this attempt to try and do this kind of mapping of, neurobiological substrates to actually interpretable cognitive theory regarding what is a habit, how does that, what composes that in the brain, what are goals, what is planning, what is action, and then from there moving on to these kind of exemplar initial active inference models, which themselves are highly relatable to reinforcement learning. So it's all to make the case that active inference, I think, it draws connections and kind of builds bridges between all of these, these other disciplines in a way that is very rich, and it's not so exclusive, right? It doesn't it doesn't stop conversations, it starts them. So, and then I also wanted to show, like, here's just a quick list of some multi-agent simulations with active inference that I think, it heavily relates. It is agent-based modeling. You can open the textbook from a couple of years ago. Agent-based modeling is there. This isn't foreign to active inference, but I hope those in the agent-based modeling community can start to see how strong these relationships are with active inference. So epistemic communities under active inference. This paper was, recreating agents who hold their own opinions about things, and they're in social networks, and so you can study how they share beliefs with one another. And yet, given a lot of these kind of formal principles in active inference, seeing how that plays out, we can actually see what the kinds of dynamics that we start to see on Twitter and other social networks, where opinion polarization begins to happen depending on how the network is set up in the first place. So it's very interesting. We also have active inference. This is much more kind of a biological or zoological example. Where there are ants in a colony who have to adjust to changing contexts, such as changing food locations, and then they leave one another pheromones so that they can actually follow one another's trails, so to speak, to find the food and come back. And then this is very recent, but we had another talk earlier today, but this paper with Connor Hines, who's one of the developers of PyMDP, which we'll be seeing shortly. He and Friston and others are developing further tools for doing active inference, and this kind of gets at the question of like nestedness and looking at how whenever you have a bunch of individual agents, what are the cases where their collective behavior actually you could fit that behavior back to the individual parameters that each of the individual agents hold. And then again, with social science, like looking at agents who have distinct roles, such as leader and follower, or it could be, you could apply this logic to many other situations. The idea is just looking at how agents who have their own distinct, available actions and beliefs, nonetheless, whenever they can kind of synchronize in their capacity to fulfill, a goal that they collectively have. So it kind of speaks to the idea of having heterogeneous agents with heterogeneous, concerns, but nonetheless with an umbrella collective concern, they're able to accomplish their goal. This next one, rather long title, Active Inference Framework for Collective Parallel Problem Solving on NK Landscapes. This is, I gave this at the tutorial a couple months ago. I just recreated. This was the point I was trying to make. You can recreate a lot of these old traditional agent-based models, using active inference agents. That's what I'm claiming. So I'm not trying to say, oh, all of these traditional models are obsolete. Not at all. I think there's so many fascinating design principles. I would love one day to recreate the Santa Fe Institute's artificial stock market, but with active inference agents, right? We can do that. So here I just recreated one where you have agents who are collectively trying to solve a problem represented on an NK landscape, meaning that they're trying to solve a very complex problem where there are a lot of interdependencies in different subparts of the problem. It's like trying to design a car. It's like, well, you can have a great car, but if you remove the wheels, it's no longer going to really be the kind of car that you need, right? Or you can remove the steering wheel, right? You need to have a certain combination of pieces there to have a proper solution. So agents collectively do that, and then you can study like, well, how well do they do that? Do they get stuck, with a suboptimal solution? And then furthermore, you can look at metrics like, oh, if we run this in different ways, what is the connectedness needed for them to reach the optimal solution or otherwise? So, and then finally, this is not an active inference paper, but this is just a reinforcement learning, based problem. But I included it here because I just want to make the point that this is focused on industry, right? This is focused on multi-agent settings where you can have them kind of work in a manufacturing firm that involves like making a lot of kind of rapid decisions in order to manufacture particular products. How you could have agents kind of synchronized in a way that they can accomplish, that goal. And again, similarly with traditional agent-based modeling, where you could, swap them out with active inference agents, so to speak, you might be able to do this, take that same approach with looking at how people are using reinforcement learning today. I think it'd lead to very interesting results. So again, just trying to bridge these kind of, dialogues between people. So now we'll move to LLMs as agents. This, I just think it really needs to be addressed. LLMs have been increasingly integrated into a wide array of potential use cases. I included some resources here, like there are just dozens on dozens of research papers that are being published that try to use LLMs in these kind of agentic ways, where it's as if an LLM is an agent who, supposedly makes decisions autonomously and so on. Again, they're showing more and more sophisticated reasoning capacities. They're having kind of longer context windows and output windows, meaning you can feed them even more information at one time. They can release even more or output even more information at one time. You can also upload your own text files, documents, write your own prompts for them to respond to. So in that case, if an LLM really is an agent, then why not just skip all of this stuff with reinforcement learning, with active inference? Why not go straight to using LLMs as agents? Of course, I'm going to argue like we should not do that. That would be, it would be irresponsible at this current moment in time in terms of LLM development. I would argue that would be kind of irresponsible unless you're just kind of making some kind of entertaining or fun app that uses LLMs or something. But for something that calls for much more discretion, I would not do that. So what are the biases here? LLMs are trained on large corpuses of existing text. We all know this. What that does is it kind of sediments a series of cultural, scientific, explanatory, rhetorical, prejudiced information, figuratively, the snapshot of the retrievable, web scrapable internet, other digitized human and AI produced texts, to which the LLM's internal parameters, which are black box parameters. Now we have LLMs being trained to where they have 7+ billion parameters on the inside. And then consequently, their outputs are just kind of reflective of this. So a lot of these, prejudices have been addressed. Very obvious, in a certain way, very unfortunate things that we saw with initial LLMs were like racist, or sexist or otherwise kind of outputs coming from them based upon the materials they were trained on. People are trying to find different ways of training them differently to get them to elicit the responses that we want. But that's the thing. What's crucial when working with LLMs is the prompt itself. So I want to think, just put yourself in the chair, facing a computer, and you're using an LLM. What's really going on? You as the user, you prompt the LLM after it's already been trained. You have your own purpose or goal in mind that the LLM does not hold for itself. Quick mention, I'm aware that I'm doing some slideshow karaoke. I just, for anyone who's like, there's a lot of information. I want to make sure I cover it thoroughly. So the user must provide the context for this goal or purpose in their prompts in the hope that the LLM will catch on. Less figuratively, they hope that the LLM will be able to predict the series of words and sentences which correspond, in the user's final opinion, to the answer the user needs or wants, right? And so after training, the LLM, it can't actually learn what the user needs. It's always in the user's opinion, and we'll get more into that. But again, it's just making the point the prompt itself is incredibly important. This is kind of a simplified, ever so slightly exaggerated, illustration of the kinds of things I'm talking about. So if I go to an LLM and say, "Hi, my name's Andrew," it says, "Hi, Andrew," it now knows my name. How can I help you today? I ask it, help me prepare, I have a certain goal in mind. I tell it, help me prepare an initial draft for a pro forma business model, for an idea I have. Here are the following details that should go into that business model. Then it produces it for me And today it can even release it as a text file. And so I could click on it, download it. Great. Now, what happens whenever our conversation history is deleted? What happens whenever we exceed the context window that is repeatedly being sent back to the LLM every time I prompt it? We have context loss. So whenever that happens, the LLM, I say, okay, now please help me revise the file. Please provide the file you mentioned. It does not recall anything that came prior, right? What is my name? Your name is me, which is a slightly exaggerated example, but it just really wanted to make the point. Like, it will use its reasoning where it's capable, right? And confabulation is a kind of a technical word. LLMs hallucinate in the sense that they can kind of reason things in a way that they end up coming up with false information. You know, um, we have to be careful about that, right? We have to be very cautious about a lot of these characteristics of LLMs. They effectively, I mean, I would highly relate it to someone who has anterograde amnesia, right? It's where someone cannot actually recall what has happened in the recent past, and nothing you tell it actually gets committed to long-term memory. And so I've kind of crudely used the phrase like the LLMs are kind of like talking heads. You have to repeatedly tell it everything in every prompt. And what's going on when you interact with ChatGPT is that a lot of this conversational history is being stored in the site in some kind of cache and being resent, and you're not seeing that process because they want it to be a nice user interface to where you can more easily use it. So recent agentic frameworks and workflows abound in recent research, yet the issues presented by limited context windows, confabulation, etc., still abound. LLMs with these conversational histories have been considered to be agents in various cases, yet in order to try and overcome some of the issues that I pointed out, there are a variety of frameworks that are being developed. So one idea is an actor-critic framework. You could have two or more agents. You give them different role prompts. You tell one of them, "Oh, you're a creative, scientist," and the other one, you say, "Oh, you're a harsh critic and an expert in literature on this scientific topic." And then you can have the first agent try and innovate and come up with something, and then the second agent critiques the former agent. So you have this kind of way of like, oh, in order to better ground the information that one of the so-called agents is creating, you can use another agent to kind of critique that and make it more grounded to reality. Another way of doing this is building up databases of retrieved documents. That is, it's an attempt to overcome the limits of context windows. So what you can do is you can repeatedly query an LLM and any true information, as well as any information you provide yourself through your own documents, your own prompts, any kind of formal documents you want to submit. You could kind of collect these in some kind of organized database, and then you could query that database in a way that repeatedly send into the context window. Here's only the information that needs to be said right now, based on everything I have. And then that database kind of acts as your ground truth. That's a means of doing it. It's rather sophisticated. There are different ways of doing that. We'll get to that soon. And finally, there's a thinking or reflecting framework. I'm just spending a second on that. It's where you have an LLM come up with things, but then have it revise its previous responses. Very similar to an actor-critic framework. It's just you're viewing it as one so-called agent doing this as opposed to two. In all cases, the prompts are still incredibly important. So what's in a prompt? Well, there are many people who have now, coined the phrase prompt engineering, which is at this point has kind of become a field or even art in and of itself. This is a recent systematic survey of prompt engineering that covers literally dozens of techniques. For anyone who's interested in that, there are many ways of doing this, and furthermore, some other problems include difficulties handling numerical or symbolic problems. So intuitively, if you read 2 + 2 = 4 as a string, as opposed to being able to recognize, oh, these are two numerical values that need to be added via an addition rule to compute a further value. It might not be tokenized properly. And so the LLM doesn't actually know how to deal with that, despite the fact that to you it's very obviously just a mathematical statement. So LLMs are getting better at dealing with math, much better actually, but they still risk this kind of imprecision. So if we want to actually incorporate LLMs into software applications, especially those that have stakes, right? Those that have real world consequences where you're actually employing them in any kind of like in-depth industry related setting in relation to what John was saying, in any kind of ecological setting, situation where you'd want to really carefully take care of things, verify the information and so on. You need everything to be much more precise and trackable than whenever you use LLMs in your application. You could have your application, such as if you're developing this in Python or Julia or otherwise, you could have that code actually handle the math, which is something we typically already do. As well as any kind of like if you're able to hard code any kind of rules that you can extract out of the text and actually consider those to be kind of programmable, and then you can have them in your program and have that logic be carried out outside of the LLM, and you can just have the LLM handle the natural language aspects. So kind of my proposal, and this, I don't want to spend too much time on this because we'll see some diagrams that actually represent the ideas here. But I argue that we should be thinking about things like pre-structured prompts with what I'll call empty spaces. For anyone who uses Python, it's very simple. You just create a bunch of pre-constructed prompts that are structured in a way that you can basically supply the prompt here. You don't have to do this word for word, but you're effectively saying, here is what I need. Here is how I need it, how I need your output to be structured. Here are my current, thoughts or beliefs of what's going on. Give me what I need. But they make it an F string to where you can have kind of these empty spaces in between the prompt, to where at any given moment in time, say in an agent-based model, you can send the most recent updated information through the F string literal. So it's like you have a really nice prompt that really gets at what you want the LLM to send back to you. But if you want to have this run algorithmically, in a way that let it run autonomously, it needs to be that the information in that prompt needs to be repeatedly updated. Again, like reminding the person with anterograde amnesia what's going on now, and then an hour later, what's going on then, and so on. Bringing it back to active inference agents, we know they change their minds through perception. They act to change the world. They actually have capacity for learning, including online learning in real time, updating their internal model parameters, which might be likened to synaptic learning or modulation in the brain, updating their beliefs about the relationships between observations and states, the efficacy of their own actions, a lot of these other kind of cognitive mechanisms that LLMs lack. So to bring it back, LLMs, if they were like agents, I would say that they're like agents who cannot act nor learn. They only observe and infer. There's been one argument that they do act. It's just they don't quite, that because they don't learn anything, it doesn't quite matter, and they can't really observe the outcome of their action. It's like their action is they output, words and sentences, and that doesn't actually come back and impact them necessarily in any kind of tangible long-term way. They are typically trained once, very expensive process. Some people have tried to specialize LLMs by only training them predominantly on medical text to make a kind of a medical LLM or a legal text for a legal LLM, but still we're stuck in this like lack of online learning or something like clear preferences. From a neurobiological perspective, LLMs have very broad yet immutable long-term memory, and they're trained on a lot of information, and then they have a highly variable short-term memory. Their context window, which if anything happens to that and it's gone, then they've lost all context. And so I argue that we should think of LLMs, as a language processing tool. I think they're very effective at that. They absolutely outperform us in terms of being able to feed them many texts and then quizzing them on those texts. Just in the plainest day, they far out. They exceed us, and this part of why they're so popular now and being considered for software applications. And from this vantage point, we can envision augmenting agents who learn and act, such as active inference agents, with something like the capacity for natural language is how I'm currently phrasing it. So this is kind of my diagrammatic, attempt at formalizing this for anyone. These are a lot of the design principles that are going into our biofirm that we're developing, right? I started developing this whenever I considered how could I have an active inference agent write a scientific paper by prompting an LLM like on its own, right? So each action of the agent was, prompt the LLM to find more literature and citations. Another discrete action is, write or revise your abstract, and these other aspects of writing a paper, and then seeing if it can kind of, choose for itself what to write, rewrite, update, and so on, and how would that work. And so a lot of that thinking has kind of gone into this project. In this case, what you would have is, for a user of the biofirm, they would be able to kind of, submit their own documents, PDFs, text. This is kind of the grounding truth representative of, the user's own preferences, their goals, what it is they want to accomplish. That gets input into structured prompts, F-string literals, like the empty spaces. That way, it'll basically take your inputted information and restructure it in a way that's needed to get the kind of answer and the kind of response that you need. So the documents are sent to the structured prompt, which is then itself sent to the LLM, which processes it and returns your structured response. Structured responses, allows encoding for agent observations, meaning you could, in a very simplistic example, you could ask an LLM, is this a good idea? Yes or no. And that can be encoded as a 0 or a 1. And then the 0 or 1 can then be, read up as an observation for a particular observation modality that an agent, a POMDP, is equipped with, right? That's very kind of elementary approach, but I hope it maybe explains the idea for programmers who are interested in these kinds of things. And so, that observation is then taken in, and then the agent can infer states per usual. What it takes the LLM's, feedback into account in its decision making, and then we have expected free energy, meaning, the free energy it computes condition on its preferences, right? So it's like saying, oh, the agent can take in an LLM's, natural language based feedback to the user's initial preferences as elicited in natural language, and the agent can use that feedback to make decisions in order to follow through on its own preferences or goals, right? So you have this kind of reciprocal relationship between the user and via the LLM vicariously to the agent, and then back again, as you can take the agent's current internal beliefs. It elicited this policy. It now believes this. It previously observed this. Those can be put back into a structured prompt, which could then be sent to an LLM for a new structured response. And that might be something that involves like reporting, like the agent is, in natural language reporting its beliefs about what's going on. And then that can be useful to the user and then be sent to what we'll for now call a knowledge graph. Apologies, I just now realized that this is being covered. Yeah. And so then this knowledge graph, and we'll get more into that. I was very happy to hear some other people making references to knowledge graphs during the symposium. It can be done in different ways, but a general sense of a knowledge graph is that this is kind of like your database of knowledge that you're gathering over time in terms of, natural language based knowledge. So it's kind of like you're storing the context of the moment. You're kind of storing the truth. You're storing the history of what's going on in terms of these agent LLM interactions. And then that way the user has the means of reviewing for themselves in everyday terms what has played out during the course of simulation. So that's kind of the design principle. And then the knowledge graph, this is a way of kind of overcoming the limited context window issue. So in a general sense, and I'll mention a lot of my thinking about the knowledge graph comes out of this really like very recent, exciting work being done by Marcus J. Buehler, who works at MIT right now. He's been trying to find ways of using LLMs to basically go over many texts in order to find patterns in the text that can then be kind of put together almost in this like a Schumpeterian like innovation way of like just recombining materials that already exist in text, but maybe humans themselves have not yet made those connections themselves of, we know all of these many different things. If we look at it this way, that actually leads to a new innovation that we could come up with. We just didn't make that connection before, but we did now. It's like, you can have LLMs who are highly, sophisticated whenever it comes to going over large amounts of text, having them make those kinds of discoveries. So anyway, that's the kind of where this is coming out of. And then sources for updating the knowledge in the graph may include user documents, up-to-date environment or resource reports and agent beliefs, domain knowledge regarding your use case, LLM responses to structured queries. We kind of looked at that before. Business model as a shared narrative. It doesn't have to be a business model, but it could be you have many in the context of the BioFirm, which we'll get into shortly. The idea is agents are working for a firm, and so they need to have this shared narrative between them that kind of captures all the crucial core elements, describing what are the operations of the firm, what are the guidelines, what are things that they need to attend to, regulatory or legal standards, what are their current financial statements, what resources do they currently have available, what are the perspectives of all their different stakeholders, being able to synthesize that information into kind of a singular document that's short enough that but nonetheless rich enough that it can be repeatedly sent back to the LLM to remind the LLM, this is what we care about, these are our constraints, these are our central concerns right now or otherwise. So anyway, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but that's how we can start to develop a knowledge graph, overcoming the limited context window by having a graphical structure to the knowledge. You can keep it nicely organized. And as we know with graph structures, with having nodes and edges, you can have along the edges can kind of be the descriptors that relate, multiple concepts as nodes, right? So you can kind of traverse this knowledge graph to make connections between all the entities within it. These are the visuals here. Actually, Daniel created these based on some particular LLM structured prompts that he ran and then kind of analyzed. And so these kind of principles are going into it. So by using pre-structured prompts and querying our knowledge graph, we can repeatedly kind of communicate what is the situational context of what's going on in the moment, as well as here's the knowledge that we've accumulated so far that can help with problem solving during the moment. This allows us to filter down only to the needed information and synthesize it, reducing the final amount of information, in this case, tokens, which also, if you're using the OpenAI API, to use the most recent, like state-of-the-art models, where we're usually spending at least a few pennies per LLM prompt, or well, it depends. But the point is, by reducing the amount of information flow needed, you can keep the costs significantly lower as well. And then also quickly overcome that issue of potentially exceeding the limit of the context window. And I'm interested in finding different ways of describing this. I'm particularly a large fan of Yori Busaki, a neuroscientist at NYU who does a lot of work on neurobiology and has even worked with Friston at a point in the past. But so I included him to try and give a metaphor of this. This conceptually can be likened to theories of episodic memory in the brain. For example, this one theory that the hippocampus in the brain is something like a pointer. So whenever you try to recall, an episode in your life, that involved, certain many episodes, like in order to tell a story of what happened yesterday, starting from the morning, and then what did you do, at noon, and what did you do in the afternoon, and so on. Like the hippocampus is a kind of pointer that kind of or almost like a librarian that goes through your long-term memory to kind of pull out sequentially what's needed in order for you to tell that story or narrative in the moment. Or from a kind of more industrial or a modern data analytics example, you could think of this as querying a database, SQL or MongoDB, meaning it could be a structured or unstructured database, where a report is synthesized via joining and querying only the necessary tables or catalogs of logged information needed for the report. So again, it's this graphical structure that allows us to kind of more quickly get the information we need without having to pull too much more than what we need. So now this is an example of, I'm just currently phrasing this as like agent foraging and knowledge updating. So it could be starting from the top left, we have our homeostatic agents. John made a reference to them earlier. But the sense is that these are agents who have their own preferences for, maintaining their own homeostasis. They might be trying to maintain the homeostasis of their environment in the case of an agent who's designed to take care of an environment, which is what we'll see in the BioFirm. They'll have their own current beliefs. They're being updated over time. We saw kind of an image of the inner dynamics of what that looks like for a POMDP earlier. They might have their own goals, which again, in this case, would probably align with the idea of maintaining homeostasis. Based on all of those factors, that might lead to, some pre-structured prompt leading to something more specific. So in this case, this is an agent who wants to take care of an environment. And this is an agent who specifically is looking at how to take care of the soil on a natural farm, like a land preserve or farm. And so they need more information about the soil structure. So they prompt the LLM, what are causal determinants of soil structure in farms? This is like an initial, this is whenever you're first making the knowledge graph, you would want to have this knowledge at the very beginning of a simulation, right? So this is kind of building out your knowledge graph to start. So you could ask it this, you could tell it to cite your sources, or you could integrate some kind of API, such as Semantic Scholar or other APIs to try and check if it's actually pulling from real citations. Again, we have that risk of confabulation, making up seemingly true information. And so we want to just kind of keep a check on that. So the LLM can tell you a lot of natural language based information about soil structure, the determinants, different kinds of management practices that could be used to take care of it, different kinds of conditions and relationships between the soil structure and other aspects of the soil, what's around it, all these different things. And then from there, we could kind of go back to the knowledge graph, store this, deconstruct this information. Ideally, this would be, we'd ask the LLM to structure its output in a particular way, and then we could send those different aspects of its response into different areas of our knowledge graph. So soil structure, determinants, management conditions, and then also track the citations. The knowledge graph, again, it's almost like a three-dimensional structure in that you could add the time dimension. That is, you could timestamp when all of this information is collected as well. So it depends on how sophisticated you want to make your knowledge graph. This is the last diagram I have related to this concept, but I just want to include it. This is what I mean by a structured prompt with empty spaces, right? So we have that same agent from before. Now we're sending a structured prompt. I believe that, so this is pre-structured, right? These curly brackets kind of denote like these are what are the so-called empty spaces. I believe whatever your current environment variables are currently, here's what the agent's beliefs are, but our goal is, here's our current business model, and our current constraints are, here are our current constraints. What solutions exist to address this? This is incredibly short and simplistic just for the sake of illustration, but the idea is you could keep these environment variables stored in your local environment. Python is storing and processing them. The agent beliefs are being extracted from the agent. You could re-encode those with natural language. You could include information like, oh, this agent's belief is representative of the quality of its environment. So then this gets read as a sentence that's something like the agent believes with a 0.2 probability or a very low probability that the current state of its environment is good. You could re-encode that. So this is really a conceptual kind of move to try and find ways of bridging the gap between qualitative and quantitative information. At no point am I saying that all of this is the absolute best way to do this. What I am saying is that this feels a little bit like frontier work. The LLMs are bringing up the question of how can we properly integrate them into software applications, and I think these are the kind of next steps in terms of our thinking of how maybe we should be approaching this. So, and then you can see again for the rest of the diagram, we still have this communication. We can continue updating our knowledge graph. We can also pull information back out of the knowledge graph to send into the structured prompt. This can all be sent to the LLM. And so the LLM could do, you could request it to return your response in multiple ways. One way is you could tell it, explain to me in natural language, what solutions exist to address this, and then also ask it in the same move, also give me, these encodings of your answer. So it could be that the LLM responds some kind of natural language explanation of how to handle this problem, but additionally, here's the structured encoding you requested, denoted as follows: a positive 1 approved recommendation to carry out available action 6 might be the case that this your agent has an observation modality, meaning it has like a sensory receptor for the LLM, where a 1 it corresponds to like an observation level of like a yes or an approval, or go for it basically, and then 6 is kind of like a second observation modality where the LLM tells you which one of your available actions you should take. So this is just an attempt at trying to find ways to modify an agent's architecture such that it has a kind of receptivity to LLM outputs in a way that can go from natural language to actual directives over what to do given the current context and all the information you've asked of that you've provided to the LLM in the structured prompt. Now we move to the BioFirm. So the BioFirm, like this is a lot of the principles I've described thus far kind of play into this. Again, a lot of work has been done on this by Daniel Friedman here in the talk, and then a lot of initial kind of coding work was done by myself. And then we've, of course, been under guidance and with partnership of John Clippinger, as well as David Lovejoy with First Principles First. I really like a lot of kind of the media and writing and podcasts that they've been doing. And so I would strongly suggest checking them out. And it's been a pleasure working with them so far. And so with the BioFirm, we have a significant amount of code largely built out, and kind of organized by Daniel under the Active Inference Institute's own GitHub repository, currently in a sub-project BioFirm. We also have a whole nother library that we'll look at soon, but for now, this is kind of the starting point of the BioFirm. Tool highlights. Right now, we're building active inference agents as using PyMDP, which is essentially has already been referenced earlier in the symposium, a kind of port of SPM, the MATLAB library developed by Friston and others, and so it's been a really good library to kind of work with and quickly start trying to implement some of our ideas. The OpenAI API. Many of you who have worked with LLMs and tried to integrate them into code are already familiar with this, but basically it's a way of quickly being able to prompt within your coding environment a wide array of LLMs, including the most recent ones and the new ChatGPT or Llama or otherwise models, Claude, Sonnet, and then Cursor, which this is not necessarily essential to developing the BioFirm, but it's just Daniel has kind of opened my eyes, so to speak, to the wonders of kind of integrating for developers, being able to have an IDE where you're editing code, and then you can use an LLM to help you write that code. And obviously, you always want to go back and look and make sure that it wrote the code that you actually intended. But you can dramatically reduce the number of times you need to hop into, say, Stack Overflow, for example, if that makes sense to programmers. So it's great for productivity. And then also some major things. Daniel put out these live streams that cover a lot of the development of the BioFirm so far. Both of them are huge. I mean, we're looking at a couple of hours or so of material, and we have close direct code walkthroughs. Today, originally, ideally, I might have gone through some kind of code walkthrough. One, I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of being able to we can demonstrate the principles, but in order to have something that's kind of like within the context of, okay, we're doing, the Active Inference Symposium, and we kind of need to keep things streamlined. We're not quite there yet, but you can get a very big picture of what's going on in that code and get an actual code walkthrough by having a look at these live streams that Daniel put out. So the BioFirm. Excuse me. Essentially, in a BioFirm, agents are working in a firm. It's like setting the scene to maintain the homeostasis of an environment. It could be a farm, natural land preserve, and it could be many things. But for now, I'm trying to kind of constrain to kind of an example. Agents prefer, both in a colloquial sense, they want this, but also in a sort of Bayesian priors computational sense, to observe themselves maintaining their environment homeostasis. Their own survival and health, in this sense, are directly linked with environmental survival and health, mapping internal states to inferred external states, meaning their own internal beliefs are, they're trying to model their own beliefs directly as, kind of these proxies for what's going on outside of them in the environment. So they're very directly trying to map themselves to their environment. All of that being conditioned on preferences. Again, what do they prefer? Homeostasis, right? So they're trying to model their environment internally for themselves while simultaneously trying to keep that environment within some kind of homeostatic range. We'll get to a more concrete example of what that means. But for now, we can just think of it as like, that an agent's own homeostasis involves realizing his preferences, relatable to how humans infer and act to maintain their body temperature, oxygen, and blood flow, sense of safety, security, whether it be physical or economic. So in this case, minimizing their own uncertainty, conditioned on preferences, maintaining homeostasis is equivalent to minimizing uncertainty about if the agent is successfully keeping the environment in a homeostatic state. That's kind of a one sentence, concise way of looking at that. They're minimizing their certainty about if they're able to successfully maintain the environment in a homeostatic state. From there, we, ideally what we would do is move on to building a knowledge base, for example, a kind of knowledge graph, which itself would, in an initial setup phase, would involve user submitted documents. So for our example case, we actually did submit both a real document that John supplied related to this farmland, kind of natural preserve that he himself is taking care of. Of course, it's been redacted. But the point is that this gives us a kind of real world example that we are quite familiar with, contained in a document that we can use, for an initial testing use case. And then you can also do other things. You can send in specific kinds of like structured queries, asking for more domain knowledge or information about, say, how do we take care of a farm or otherwise. And we have all of that. And we follow that up by, structured prompting. Another idea we have that I won't go too much into right now, but one idea is that you could actually extract out of natural language, potentially like syllogistic reasoning based rules. There's a researcher, Axel Constant, who's done some work in the legal domain and looking at kind of Bayesian probability and graphs and relating that to syllogistic reasoning. I think that would be a really nice way of concisely extracting natural language rules, turning them into something kind of like symbolic objects in Python that can be used as formulae for doing different kinds of reasoning that increases precision and reduces the need to make so many LLM calls and having the LLM do that. But it's a thought. Anyway, in any case, all of this, the whole development of the knowledge base or knowledge graph is motivated by agent preferences and beliefs. So social science, and I don't want to get too far away from that. I've been talking about a lot of design principles, but I think the BioFirm itself, as currently it is an open source, sort of resource, it's still heavily under development. I'll get back to the aspects of what's going on with that a little bit later. But currently there's a lot of development being made and is being written in a way that we ideally in the future would like this to be adaptable to different circumstances. It might be the case that this could be quite useful actually for continuing social scientific research in the form of an agent-based model. You could consider that these might not necessarily be agents in a firm. They might not have a business model. They might have something else. They might have, a constitution, that links all of them or otherwise. For now, I'll continue working, focusing on the BioFirm, but I just want that to be borne in mind that I don't want to present this as if it's a highly specific use case that, doesn't generalize, allow for generalizing beyond itself. But for now, we'll stick with focusing on it. So social science, we have agents who are collaborating in coalitions of agents and networks of agents. We have, I'm attempting to say that we can augment agents with natural language, state belief reporting, with consequent development of a cultural, and this is Dr. Clippinger's view, if we have agents who are motivated to take care of land and then they collect knowledge that corresponds to them, and then they're using and communicating using this knowledge, then this kind of becomes something like a culture. So we're looking at something like a kind of cultural grammar or set of scripts that are being developed via these agents taking care of the land around them, and we have shared narratives. And then on top of that, we also, in a realistic scenario, we would have agents who are doing economic resource management and potentially trying to generate some kind of value in some kind of way, basically replenishing or regenerating sources available to themselves or otherwise. And then on value generation, and this comes back to the very start where I referred to utility as being kind of like what was previously the penultimate sort of incentive for agents in traditional agent-based modeling. Now, if we shift that to where now we're looking at expected free energy as the thing to be minimized, and in correspondence with the principles of active inference, then what we're doing is that we're looking at this is, like the approximation of uncertainty conditioned on preferences. Agents are trying to minimize that value, where they're with value generation. And a whole other thing we could do is look at each of the agents' marginal contributions to the minimization of this quantifiable metric that is expected free energy for the whole firm. Like, look at their marginal contributions to minimizing the uncertainty of the firm, and then that itself becomes a kind of value. We can accumulate that and view that as kind of like uncertainty reduction is what generates value. So that crucially, this accumulation, it's not some arbitrary floating value whose own value changes based upon some kind of market speculation dynamics or otherwise. Instead, the moment-to-moment value generation that occurs during the course of a simulation of a biofirm, it reflects the agent's actual learning and capacity for taking care of their environment as proxied by expected free energy. And then the kind of broader multi-agent setting and future vision for the biofirm, their cultural aspects, again, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of an ever-evolving accumulation of shared knowledge. Again, we could have timestamps. That also means that we might need correction of that knowledge over time. We'll talk about that more shortly. Anyway, the evolution of the knowledge graph, it's motivated by mirrors agents motivated to accomplish collective goals for homeostasis from various perspectives. You might have agents who are specialized in one way, agents in another. You might have multiple stakeholder perspectives that are being fed into that initial knowledge graph or along the way during the course of the simulation. Ethical, ideally, um, it would exhibit these kinds of principles, like by accumulating different perspectives between agents, between users, stakeholders. In the case of bioregional modeling, where there can be very, very many people potentially involved in looking at or being affected by how an environment is being cared for, taken care of, or managed or governed. Being able to actually submit these potentially conflicting or at least different perspectives from various stakeholders. Those could be submitted to the program. It could also include financial, regulatory, or sustainability related knowledge. That can allow for comparing and synthesizing various perspectives, again, in some kind of actor critic framework. As I mentioned earlier, like a lot of methods have been used to try and overcome the issues of LLMs, and so we'd be remiss not to employ those in various ways where appropriate. And that way we can better ensure that the information that's being used and processed and being fed into agent decision making and so on, taking care of an actual environment, we can make sure that it's much more accurate, coherent, also identify faulty or contentious information. If the agents come up with a very aggressive policy, prior to its implementation, it could be critiqued and revised from an ethical, regulatory, or legal standpoint. All of this is collective, and we can kind of synthesize the information. I already touched on this earlier, resynthesizing core information or primary information in the knowledge graph into being some kind of summary business model, constitution, a set of protocols or missions that the agents have. And then sustainability, resource management, making sure that agents are aware of available resources combined with quantitative analysis. So you could, if you're looking at a real world setting, you'd be looking at things like price information, forecasting supplies needed for a particular policy. You might have qualitative reasoning involved, such as why, like which supplies are needed for a task, what purposes, within what guidelines. That's something I've been thinking about as well for a related institute project called FarmWorks. We might talk about that later. We'll see. And then heterogeneity. Agents might be pre-configured or learn. They necessarily will learn over time, assuming we implement learning and their architecture. We more than likely will. It depends on how and for what purpose. And then they might even, evolve, so to speak, to specialize in different skills and knowledge uses, allowing for agents to collaborate under broad shared goals while working on subtasks. There's some nice. We were joined by Mal yesterday during the first workshop. So Mal's been involved in a lot of this previous work, and then another reference to kind of the as well the industrial example that I gave earlier as to how we might think about some of these things. Basic form of a homeostatic agent. This is just take a second. Homeostatic agent. This is the general, just kind of quick natural language summary of its internal architecture. It's incredibly simplistic. This is sort of a kernel of what is the initial formation of a homeostatic agent prior to any additional modification or changes in its architecture that you think might be required for the situation at hand. For now, let's say there's a single environmental variable. What we did, I'll talk more about it later, but the idea is that we have an environment that an artificial environment we generated. We generated it based on the documents I mentioned earlier, including John's farmland document, as well as particular prompts submitted to the LLM to kind of compose what are the initial makings of our knowledge graph. And it came up with soil structure as being one of the essential variables that should be included in our environment. And then we have an agent here who's kind of trying to map itself to this quantitative value. It is a question right now of, I can imagine those who do active inference, like the question might be, why use a POMDP? Why would you not use, a continuous time, continuous state space model For now, we're going with POMDPs in part because we're assuming that we'll be using agents to model highly complex environments where it's not so simple as to kind of follow a simple up or down scale, or say that the variable is necessarily being defined by some kind of Gaussian distribution and being sampled from it. It might be the case that this is much more complex. There might be changing conditions or otherwise. In any case, for initial testing environments, which is also a rather quick thing to do, I will admit. So, but for now, the idea is that you'd have a POMDP who can view the data over time at each time step. Daniel ran this one for, actually, I don't remember if I ran it. He probably did, over 10,000 time steps. And so at each time step, the agent observes if the current value is above or below some homeostatic range, which the agent prefers it lie in, right? And so it infers the hidden state of the variable. Is it actually, if I observe low, is it actually low? If it's in its homeostatic range, is it actually in its homeostatic range, or is it actually, in reality, is it really high or otherwise? And another question as to whether this is necessarily a partially observable environment, since this does seem to be reflective of real data. But again, this allows for the space that there might be very complex relationships between soil structure and, let's say, moisture levels in the soil, or microbial activity within the soil, or other kinds of things that really matter here, to where it's much more complex than just being able to say, oh, just because this went low, that means I need to try and bring it back up as much as possible really fast, right? So there might be more nuance, and having more sophisticated architectures might be able to kind of parse through that problem, including increasing inference horizons, or including more other variables that it tries to map. And then actions, the agent can increase, maintain, or decrease the variable. Right. So again, very simple. There are a little more details later on how that can work, but just say straightforward, it's kind of like the agent is trying to balance out this metric, given that all of its fluctuations, aside from the agent's actions impacting it, are coming from its relationship with all the other environmental variables in its ecosystem. So it's kind of like the agent is trying to map its internal understanding of what's going on with the environment's behavior. And then the agent, of course, prefers to see this within its homeostatic range. And so it will choose actions that it believes will help this variable to get back into its homeostatic range. So from there, we can view this like as a whole ecosystem of variables. So this kind of defines our environment that we're looking at, right? In an agent-based modeling setting, we have our homeostatic agents, and then we have our entire environment composed of all these environmental variables. And over in a real-world setting, whether you're running a farm, or otherwise, each of these variables could be mapped to, an IoT device. They could be mapped to, some kind of logged observations, that your team makes as to what's going on with the farm right now. I guess I'll bring up FarmWorks again briefly. We've been looking at a lot of farm data lately that's been collected by farmers, and getting some inspiration on how they go about doing those things. But I will say that this environment that we have here is entirely artificially generated based upon inspiration from text. So if we think about this as something like agents are trying to solve a non-equilibrium steady state, what does that mean? I'll try and summarize by saying that we're trying to maintain the structure and properties of the farm. What is it that makes a farm a farm? Well, if your soil moisture falls dramatically too low, and then suddenly all the organic matter in it dies, and then many of these other things start to fall apart, well, now we're not quite looking at homeostatic soil anymore, right? And so we kind of have like this natural decay or dilapidation of the system, the ecosystem. And so agents are having to repeat, like continuously, kind of actively maintain through control inputs, meaning through their actions, they're trying to keep these variables within homeostasis. And it's worth noting these target ranges, homeostatic ranges, might change themselves over time, right? Due to we can imagine the target soil temperature range might change to adjust for seasonal crop change. It also might also account for certain kinds of like exogenous or external shocks to the system. The impact of climate change, there might be a natural disaster that occurs or otherwise that itself can really change the dynamics required to attempt to maintain the ecosystem as it is or as it was, or if it needs to kind of change in order to continue existing given what kind of shock occurred. So to maintain these desired homeostatic states, the agent must continuously work against these natural tendencies towards dilapidation. States, I've already mentioned this many times, these states, these variables may have complex interdependent relationships, may call for agents with forward-looking inference horizons. Of course, if we over-maintain the soil, put too many products in it or do other things that might still be okay for the crops, it might harm local biodiversity, local animals accidentally consuming different kinds of materials that were used to take care of the soil, and suddenly they die. That harms local biodiversity. And yet, biodiversity might also include pests in the environment that themselves then harm the soil or crop growth. So it's just being able to kind of adjust to all of these highly complex variables. And crucially, in reality, we might only be able to impact some variables. Some variables and not others. Thus, agents might specialize in handling one particular controllable variable and study its relationship with the other variables, leading to actionable predictive planning. Another kind of everyday explanation of this is like, I mentioned I'm a data analyst. I work in education. And so, I'm frequently looking at a lot of data regarding students and kind of our institution and so on. I'm based in Chicago. Some things that we can change are bus routes for our students to make sure that they can get to school safely. Something we cannot control is the amount of crime in Chicago, which anyone in the U.S. knows is that would be very difficult to do. Right. So we're looking at, there are all kinds of factors in our environment that we cannot control, and then there's what we can, and then trying to find how can we control what we can control in ways that kind of can balance out with all these things that we cannot control, right? So that it's very crucial to be able to identify and then measure and analyze those kinds of relationships whenever trying to design any kind of concrete, actionable policy, right, or intervention that you might want to make. And then John referenced the commons earlier, right, in Eleanor Ostrom's work. Homeostatic agents solving non-equilibrium steady states, the ever solving the commons. So I'm trying. I was thinking about a lot of these principles, and Ostrom was required reading for me as someone who's coming, from a social sciences background, and so it's part of why I find this project so interesting, and why I find it fascinating to try to realize a lot of these things. And principles involved. So we have local rules, conditions, adaptation. I mean, the agents necessarily have to adapt to the environment around them. If you provide some kind of kernel agent and give it some space to figure out what it is it needs to do, it's necessarily going to have to adapt, right? So we have that attention towards the local, recognizing uncertainty and adaptation. Agents will have to take care of homeostasis, manage resources through learning, to change conditions in broader, unobserved, uncontrollable environment, in the sense of, there are many things going on that the agents cannot directly observe. There are other things that will occur that were unexpected. And then also there might be relationships within the variables themselves that, for example, there might be some kind of critical threshold that's hit by one variable that then has some kind of domino or cascade effect on the others, and so that's why I include both the phrases endogenous or exogenous shocks. Being able to watch out for those kinds of dynamics. Then governing the commons, that's sort of the benefit of, if it can be done right, if it can be done successfully, integrating LLMs in a very thoroughly considered way that allows for accurate information accumulation and sharing, and then using it for implementing policies. That's the aspect that kind of keeps things grounded, and then gives this kind of natural language based way of dealing with an environment. This kind of just repeats many things I mentioned before, but we're synthesizing a lot of info from various stakeholders, various domains, that are needed to handle the problem, repeatedly grounding agents at common goals from maintaining the environment against perturbation, capture, maintaining its Markov blanket, and then nested collaboration potentially. So just as users can practice oversight by running these models, agents themselves, you might have agents who are at another layer, so to speak, who maintain their own oversight over other agents or coalitions of agents, and those kind of hierarchical agents might themselves act as something like an observer role. They might recognize a broader issue going on in the firm that isn't being accounted for by specialized agents, and so you can have those kinds of kind of hierarchical, specialized structural roles that allows for this kind of nestedness in how the environment is maintained. And then it's a very interesting idea that I was going to bring up later, but in the context of like looking at bioregional hubs or something along that line, I mean, if you were actually employing something like a biofirm to a real world scenario, then I don't see any reason why you couldn't have some way of interfacing between different biofirms, right? Because if they're actually playing out in reality and building their own knowledge graphs, say in real time or some kind of way, then you could very much have that kind of interfacing. You could have structured prompts pulling from the knowledge graph of one biofirm, sending that information to another biofirm and back. So that's I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but because the vast majority of the actual concrete work that's been done on the biofirm has only been over the course of, frankly, the past couple of weeks. I mean, longer than that for sure, in terms of John developing the ideas, conversations we've had over the past couple of months. But whenever it comes to developing this stuff and actually realizing it, it's still quite new. So this is very exciting to report. BioFirm for users. Let me just see where we're at. Okay. I'm gonna have, yeah, I'll speed this up a little bit. BioFirm for users. Yeah. One, for a user's perspective, first you would submit your documents, as I mentioned many times. Your own PDFs, real world information. If you want to submit textbooks, regarding agricultural techniques and methods for taking care of farms, including formulae that describe relationships or something, you could have. From there, the direction is to have, there are two intended kind of potential paths you could take. Right now, all the testing is being done with the first path, but the ideal is to move it in the direction where you could have both available. First one is for being able to explore counterfactuals. So we generate synthetic data using domain knowledge or historical data. That's what we're already doing. And then second, direct application, that would be where you're actually able to send in data and have it being streamed and have this play out in real time. This is very much, kind of in the future, but that's sort of on the roadmap, so to speak. And then once you followed one of those paths, you could generate an environment for your agents. And then also you could construct applicable agents, meaning agents to your design or ones that kind of fit the situation or be mapped to particular environmental variables, as we saw with the agent who takes care of the soil structure earlier, using Agent Maker, which is kind of an entire addition that Daniel kind of zoomed through, being able to incorporate included. There's more information on that in the second live stream that was released. From there, you would simulate your agent-based model, meaning there'd be an initial setup phase that takes in your initial documents and so on, constructs the agents, constructs the artificial environment, then runs your action perception loop. It keeps things moving. Data and LLM responses are encoded as observations for agents. Agents take these observations, take care of their environment. So we already know homeostasis for the agent, based on how it's set up, is kind of hard coded into its design. and map to the homeostasis of its environment. And finally, there would be, obviously we would want this, analytics. So having some kind of analytics suites that allows you to derive insights from different kinds of metrics that are being recorded over time. There might be different kinds of like LLM summary reports and recommendations that actually extracts the metrics, and through a pre-structured prompt, as I've said a million times during the course of this, using pre-structured prompts, you can input a lot of these results and then have an LLM kind of put it into a natural language, like just explain for you in everyday words. Here's what happened. Here's what's going on here, what the agents believe, and so on. Bioregional modeling, I wanted to look at this really quickly. This is a lot of Daniel's work on, this is just an initial step, but what's happened is that Daniel set particular kinds of structured prompts. You can find more information on this in the first live stream, but basically asked about information in very particular ways to LLMs and did it programmatically, was able to extract an incredible amount of information about these different regions, different counties, and he started with California and then moved to New England, and then it's expanded from there. And so we have like Maine and Massachusetts. So for example, Massachusetts, Hampshire County, like you can, he sent in like, generate some kind of supply strategist statement. We have copies of these. This is a JSON form, meaning it's kind of set up in a way that can be read by the program. But then here's just a more readable, legible, every day for a user report. It's like, here is, your supply chain strategist report on the ecosystem of that county, references to what's going on in terms of its biodiversity, how climate change is impacting it, how land is used, habitat fragmentation, water quality. So just a lot of the different things that are going on specific to each of these counties. You can do that from a market analyst perspective as well. Try and consider different kinds of opportunities. What's the current economic landscape? What kind of regulatory environment compliance requirements are there? State, federal, local. Of course, these are currently very short descriptions. Ideally, over time, you would build out your knowledge graph, your knowledge base. You'd actually, kind of zoom into each of these, send more follow-up prompts, like tell me more about this. Cite the information you're pulling from, and then you could even consolidate that. So this is the kind of a consolidated report, very long for all of these different market analyst perspective, ecological perspective, supply chain strategist, and just kind of finding ways to synthesize a lot of information in one move. This was a business case, and I just wanted to show quickly, like, here are ideas of here are defining out potential revenue streams, risk assessment, mitigation strategies. So it's very 5-year financial projections. Of course, we could pull this kind of logic back into the program, have local computations done that actually comes up with much more grounded, realistic, and precise information based on available resources that you have, or that at least artificially the agents have, if you're doing more of an artificial setting. So yeah, it's making all these linkages. And so, that becomes sort of the basis, the starting point for our, for the BioFirm. So we then, again, we generated this artificial environment. All we did was send in user documents, structured prompts through an LLM, gave a structured response. Let me quickly, yeah. This allowed programming our environment, its dynamics, configuration, generating descriptions for each of the variables. They get stored in this nice JSON structured file, ecosystem config. So I mean, you saw previously, like I was looking at a GitHub repository. We're really building out the code in that base. And so anyway, that sticking back to the artificial environment here, this allows us to pull out, what are our variables, or proxies for variables, just indices. Like, it can be quite difficult to measure biodiversity, so we make an index for that. There might be other ways of doing that. There might be more specific ways of doing that fits your own use case. or otherwise we could, tailor that. Um, Domain-inspired quantitative relationships between the variables. You can even, with more manual control, you can set the noise levels for each of these. Like if you assume that there might be some noisy process, from a more mathematical or statistical perspective, which of these are actually controllable or not. For those which are controllable, how much are they controllable? Can you dramatically change biodiversity in one move? Probably not. Or you could, and I don't want to follow that thought further. BioFirm development and performance benchmarking. This is another crucial part of the BioFirm development, being able to actually benchmark how our active inference agents perform relative to, some kind of benchmark baseline, such as having a more reactive or random sort of thermostat style, like reactive control. So basically on the left, we don't have active inference agents. It's just trying, instead, this is a more basic control strategy that kind of just reacts to the data it's seeing. And of course, the data is getting very out of hand. I'm not saying it's not getting out of hand with the active inference agent, but much more so. And that's what we're seeing from an initial test case. And this active inference agent on the right is still that basic kernel homeostatic agent, right? It is keeping its target within range, 21% of the time relative to the random strategy, which is only 7. The next steps would be to actually fine tune and modify the agents to better match the situation. So far, it's very simplistic. It's only looking at one variable, only tracking one variable. It's currently not taking in any information from an LLM. It's currently not taking in any information about the other environmental variables. This was really interesting to see, though, that it already has this capacity for kind of outperforming the reactive model. We've had some instances where the active inference agent doesn't, it maybe matches the reactive model. So it's just, it's prime time to step up the agent development game, so that this was just step one. It's like, can we build it? Yes, we can. So now let's improve it. Analytics suite, we can look at, the variables themselves, their correlations with one another. We track the metrics about the environment over time, then compare how the environment behaved in different simulation settings. That's what we want to do with agent-based modeling in the first place. Typically, we want to be able to run simulations, look at the outcomes based on different circumstances. And then we can compare, how this went using different agents. We could use LLM integration to translate this into like a more readable report for users. This is a whole nother aspect I really wanted to emphasize. I've made this kind of as an additional module, so it can be edited kind of after the fact, like outside of the main program, which also means that you can modify this bit as you want. But basically, the idea is you try and measure the surprise or uncertainty or expected free energy or otherwise of the environment here, and basically look at how the actual variable diverges from where you want it to be. The difference. It's, of course, it's mathematical and it's drawing from active inference in other areas, Bayesian statistics and mechanics. But the idea is you can measure how far away it is from where you wanted it to be in terms of surprisal, actually capturing kind of this more rich or nuanced information about how that variable moves versus where you want it to be. And then you can kind of flip that, say, oh, well, in a non-equilibrium steady state system where more usually than not, the system is going to have a tendency towards generating more and more surprisal. That is the complex relationships between the variables is going to lead to things typically going off course very quickly if you don't touch them. Then in that case, any move at reducing surprise, meaning any move at combating that natural tendency towards kind of like chaos or entropy, it can be viewed as a form of generating value. And so this is the kind of additional metric we could add, saying that there's a kind of value added to having these agents, minimizing the surprise, meaning minimizing the free energy, meaning minimizing the distance between homeostasis and where the data is now. Right. So we could see that kind of accumulation over time. And again, it's modularized, meaning for a user, they could potentially experiment as they like. They could change how this value added is computed. I think that'd be very interesting for people who are interested in economic simulations, or doing this, differently, or want to see like how does this work, Then also Shapley value analysis. We have Shapley values. So through the course of these simulations, we have agents trying to solve or take care of their environment. And so in the case of Shapley value computation, what it's doing is that we can compare how do certain coalitions of agents run through the simulation compared to one another, in terms of these different metrics. And so you can see like, oh, all 5 agents together did better at maintaining their environment in homeostasis. They did better than only having this other particular coalition of agents, but they actually did worse altogether versus when you only had these 2 agents working together, right? So it's a very kind of sophisticated way at looking at how agents are actually solving the problems and actually carrying out the actions that they need to carry out. And we can do this, for different metrics. And we can view that as, that can be another way of saying this is how value is being generated by these agents, right? So being able to make those kinds of analytics. And then these are the last couple slides. GNN and Agent Maker. This is very cool. This kind of like, we did so much rapid development of the BioFirm over the past couple of weeks that this just kind of like hit me. I was like, oh, I didn't really think about that. But Daniel has incorporated, along with his co-authored work with Jakob Smikel in the past. They've worked on what's called general notation, and it's a way of kind of translating active inference agents, meaning models or architectures, between different programming languages, including being able to compose them using natural language, and then also being able to visualize them graphically. Like that's, it's not quite there yet. The kind of makings for being able to have this kind of translatability. Like, that ideal would be being able to write to an LLM, like, hey, make an agent for me that can do this and this. And then by giving the LLM certain kinds of context, it can fill in the matrices and so on as you need it. Of course, we're still a distance from that, but it's kind of building the framework towards moving towards that. And that way you can make agents who are much more tailored to the situation. And furthermore, ideally, you'd be able to translate them between programming languages, meaning, being able to switch if your application is in Python or Julia or otherwise, being able to have that done for you. And then Daniel has basically forked the PyMDP repository and then built Agent Maker on top of it. So right now it's kind of tailored to PyMDP, but it could be used in other ways as well. And so we already have some next steps on the kinds of agents we want to make. For me, it's agents who should be able to observe the whole environment, but only be able to control their own respective part. To me, that's what would make the idea of like having a shared common goal amongst heterogeneous specialized agents. Like that's what would realize that. So that's kind of the broader view of the BioFirm. You start with inputting your documents, your texts, your PDFs, data for fitting, that's optional right now. It would be more ideal for a real world setting, but for now, just generating an artificial environment, just the text is fine. We've been able to accomplish that so far. And then from there, you could fit agents to the situation, or at least maybe customize them yourself using Agent Maker. You have the start of your knowledge graph or base being developed. Then you have that ecosystem, all of its dynamics and configuration kind of spun up. Then after that, you just run the simulation, looking at analytics. We want to move towards having an interface in future, having dashboards. We've already seen a lot of these graphs earlier, so it's and then we'd also want to have LLMs that could actually report the results. And this is basically towards an adaptable kernel of a BioFirm. This is kind of the bigger picture. We have different kinds of design considerations. couple highlights, we're looking at things like implementing potentially amortized inference. We're kind of accelerating the inference process, using continuous state space predictions and models, and then considering, we have an RX Infer group at the Institute, and so we'd like to potentially move towards using a more reactive framework using RX Infer, the Julia library, as well as a kind of complementary library for environments, the RX environments library. Plenty of different ways we might be able to use different kinds of APIs or integrations with other tools, locally storing LLMs to mitigate the issue of having to necessarily use the Open API, Open AI LLM API. And then obviously integrating, key aspects are like the resource management, right? And that's actually, I would argue, is going to be one of the easier parts of incorporating, because it's like, just as we can currently read real data or generate artificial data and have the agents manage that, like soil structure, we could do that similarly for different kinds of financial resource values, or managing an account or something along those lines, right? So bringing it back, BioFirm development and testing. This is just a slide I showed earlier, but it's just to reinforce here some of the tools we use, some things we want to do in the future, some related institute projects related to, we're working on projects that relate to mitigating future existential risk. We've applied to a grant with Foresight. There's the FLI grant project, FarmWorks, ARCS, and Fur Group. There's a new economic simulations related group. Some people are interested in looking at things like, simulating currencies and so on, in agent-based modeling. And then those live stream updates. My computer's having repeatedly deciding to cover things up, and that's it. So we went much further on time intended. There was a lot to cover. Really appreciate everyone's attention, though. And in these 11 minutes we have left, if you guys want to give anything a shot, please go for it. Oh, the voice is going out.
No. Take some questions.
Yeah.
Anyone in the live chat can write a question. John, where does this take you, and or what will you plan to do tomorrow?
Well, I think what we tried to lay the foundation here in a very thorough way is what is a biofirm, and how is able to address many of the issues that you see in people trying to work out biofinancial, the bioregional economics, and create the proper incentives. And so I think what we're trying to do here is really show that there's a number. When I started to say, here are some of the criteria that we're looking for, in particular building with Eleanor Osterman, the whole idea of how to govern a commons is a profound issue that seemed to be intractable to a lot of people. I think this, in my view, this provides a framework for doing it, a scalable framework for doing it, a way of involving people, a way of applying scientific methods, and creating financial incentives, and automating a lot of the data collection analysis task, and how agents can build up their own competencies over a period of time. So there's a lot here. There's a lot to digest. And it does provide a new metric of value that's based upon you're not establishing value in the classic economics that are price arbitrage or information asymmetry arbitrage. You're actually saying there's such a thing as a free energy principle, a scientific process, and we can show how the value is created and then how to allocate it to those people or those agents that are creating it. So this is really sort of foundational. So we want to take it to the next steps. And what we're going to be doing tomorrow is actually, there's a group of people who are experts in the sense that they work with how to take multi-agent architectures and apply them to, in some cases, to the enterprise. From Deloitte is doing that. Another group, Simon Torrance, is doing it in terms of AI, looking at framework for agentic architectures. There are others who are looking at it and applying to the regional finance issues. So we have that. Susanna Choi. We also have Matt Maroney, who's head of sustainable finance and metabolic, and then there's John Havens, who's been involved with IEEE establishing ethical frameworks for the application of geospatial models and AI. So it's quite a combination of people. But what we want them to look at is what's the impact of this when you're having fully autonomous biometric-based agents, and what happens when you can apply them not just to the bioregional finance, but also the new notion of a firm. And I think it's a real profound issue here. What happens when you really have autonomous agents and you create institutions? We create institutions that are supposed to be above people, but the problem is people populate institutions and they come captured. But what happens when we start to put these agents and build institutions that are function this way, that are verifiable this way? And what does that happen to what we think about employment, jobs? And I mean, there's some really substantive issues here. And how do you create this as a public resource, a public good that doesn't get captured by particularly small interests? So there's a broad spectrum of questions we're putting out there. That I don't think that the public in general fully appreciates the capacity and the power of an active inference free energy principle as applied to an economic and societal issue. So we're going to try to tackle those issues and get people talking about it. And this is a beginning, but we want to take it next steps and really get actual reference technologies out there that we can actually show and demonstrate and be able to replicate. So that's the goal.
Yeah.
And you're very helpful. I gotta say, Daniel, kudos to you from all along. I mean, both you guys, and Daniel, you've done remarkable work in accelerating this process. And we're very, very grateful for that. And what Active Inference Institute, there's other things the other sessions I saw here that seem to be very relevant to what we're doing. So I'm really looking forward to collaborating. I'm quite fascinated with ThoughtForge, what Matt Brown is doing homeostatic networks, and it goes back to Ashby and the law of requisite variety. I think all of that's applicable to this too. So there's this wonderful synthesis that you've enabled. You really have, and through a singular effort. So again, extremely grateful for this.
Thank you. It's been awesome, and a lot more I could say, but what can?
Well, we're gonna ask more of you.
I'm not done yet.
You're not done. No, we're gonna no.
The part that resonated with me in the presentation over the last 2 days of BioFirm and how Andrew laid out all these pieces is like, on one hand, we have that researcher lens, again, about similarities and differences and about treating it like it's an engineering problem. And then I think, John, you've brought in the deeper history of commons and cybernetics and these more open-ended problems about how do we connect any technical capacity to the embodiment and the co-enactment of systems that are livable and regenerative. And that's a little bit of a different kind of topic. That's one, though, that mass convening and awareness can fertilize and make real in a way where the technical understanding, it's like, you can read it for 20 years. It's like, it is just going to be the textbook. It's just going to be something to jump off of and take into another way. It's not like some of these questions about how different regions will work. It's not in the 2022 textbook. So that's applying active inference, is taking the high road and the low road and variational free energy, expected free energy, like all of those formalisms, and then, like, surprise, surprise, applying them to what matters and figuring out that project and operational part. And there's just like, there's so many pieces. was just like thinking of the yarn connecting the needs to what we do and don't have at different levels of readiness. That takes us back to the tech tree and all these other ways that we've discussed coordinating around that balanced way to think about regional and what is federated, what is transferable, how do we deal with all of these aspects. And it's been a great journey over the last few months also.
Well, thank you. What I find so reassuring is that, and you see applying the method, and then it starts to explain, and you keep applying it, and so it doesn't fade out. It doesn't. You're not getting ad hoc. It doesn't become ad hoc. And so I feel like we're doing something really principled that is extensible. And when I come from the biofinance community and see all the things that they've been trying to do, or in the commons community, they say, actually, there's a wonderful fit here. And getting these two worlds together is really important. It's a challenge too. But I people want to do that, and they're looking for something like this. And so I really hope that we can be able to create that marriage, as it were.
To add one comment on that, I think when you opened today and said, well, we could make things fungible, we can connect, but that is also part of replicating, if not elaborating, the problem, which is the fungibility of drinking water here and this calorie here and this unique species here. Facilitating that fungibility is facilitating the capture of the underlying resource. So even if it were somehow trivial to make like assertions about impact monetized and the whole hypercerts and impact certification, even if that were trivial and we can just assume that we have full observability or something like that, it could even accelerate financial capital based cascades. And so what can be an escape grounding to that? And that's where seeing like, whoa, the models on through the paradigm of incentives are maximalist and reward oriented. Can they be homeostatic or allostatic oriented to satisfy and be on paths that bound surprise rather than try to maximize? But then as soon as we look around the world, there's things that don't make sense. We're not trying to maximize or minimize, like the reservoir, but rather within a range. And so there's so many things where we can just connect first principles of intelligence and research questions to just like the calm, subtle, sometimes ways that the technology, because to move too fast also would again replicate fallacies.
Right.
Okay, well, good luck with the session tomorrow.
Okay.
And I hope many people come join and engage in these fun, open source, meaningful projects.
This is just the beginning.
It's just a checkpoint, and
it's a strong one, and I'm very pleased with it. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, fellas. See you later.
Okay, guys.
Right.
Thank you.